Thank you for signing in to listen to this British Chamber of Commerce EU and Belgium event in conjunction with Euraffex, looking at, as I said, at how trade negotiations really work. And I'm joined today by César Guerrero, who is the Euraffex Global Trade Director, but prior to that, he was the Mexican chief negotiator, notably for the Mexican trade agreement that was recently done between Mexico and the European Union. But he'd also worked for many, many years on Mexican trade issues, including in the WTO, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also with the updated NAFTA negotiations, the USMC. So he's hugely knowledgeable on what actually happens in all of these trade negotiations. So we're delighted to have you here with us, César. Just to let you know from my side, so my name's Daniel Dalton. I'm the CEO of the British Chamber of Commerce in Brussels, which covers both the EU and Belgium. And prior to that, I was a member of the European Parliament, and I did work from the political side on some of the EU trade agreements, particularly with Canada and Japan. So hopefully between the two of us, you have the politician's view and the negotiator view. So hopefully you'll get an idea of exactly how this works, and that's hopefully what we're aiming for. Just to let you know, we have a chat feature, and if you want to ask any questions at any stage during this, please put your questions into the chat, and I will do my best to ask César the question. And please don't be shy with that. Really, it's great to help the conversation flowing. But we will get started. And the first question I really want to ask you, César, is, you know, you're a trade negotiator. You get the mandate from the politicians who turn around and say, César, we want to negotiate a trade agreement with the EU, for example, or update our agreement. Here's what we want. Here are our demands. We don't want you to give away too much, but this is what you can give away. Here you go. Off you go. And what happens next? How then does your role work from there?
Well, when you have this kind of mandates from politicians, normally the counterpart negotiates as well with the politician what they should expect from a negotiation, and then the counterpart engage with the negotiating party in having an exchange of the mandate, because it has to be a common mandate. I mean, you either have two mandates from politicians, or you come for example, with a joint vision report. This is a tool that the European Commission utilizes to have clarity before the launching of the negotiations. So sometimes when you have a very detailed negotiating mandate, is very difficult to address all the expectations from a politician. So the broader the mandate, the better for the negotiators. So the ambiguity allows you to be creative and find solutions on different issues. Additionally, the mandate coming from politicians allows the counterpart, for example, if the European Union, the European Commission comes with a very specific mandate from a politician, it shows the counterpart the hot topics, the expectations, the level of ambition the politicians have in these negotiations. So they can use this document to push their own agenda in favor of their own interests. But again, you cannot have a very detailed and ambition mandate, because you run the risk that the counterpart would not be feeling comfortable sitting in the negotiating table, having in mind that it's already prejudged some of the issues that are there. So the mandates, when there is a discussion on a negotiation, there's a discussion before launching negotiations on what to expect, and where there are differences. Having a general wording allows both parties to start negotiations without prejudicing the outcome or the negotiations itself.
And with those sort of discussions, at what level would they be happening? Would they be happening at political level, or would you as the negotiators be quietly sort of scoping out these issues?
I would say it's a chief negotiator level, because you have to make decisions. You have to accommodate the interests of the counterpart, showing that difficult issues are still there, that you are ready to discuss those issues. And those issues are politically sensitive as well. For example, if I use my experience, the case of Mexico, government procurement was a very difficult issue because Mexico never had negotiated government procurement at a federal level. So when the joint vision report was discussed before launching negotiations, of course, the European Commission wanted to have commitments by Mexico because it was the request from member states to have commitments on government procurement at the federal level. However, if we had this kind of language in the joint vision report, that would already prejudge the position of Mexico. So in this case, when you have a joint vision report that is the basis for the mandate for the negotiations, the negotiations start basically on this document, on the specific mandate. So it can be very detailed, or, for example, I remember when Mexico joined the TPP, the market access mandate, the conditions was a very general one-pager with some instructions. And so the negotiation is open for it would not prejudge the level of ambition. So depending on the regions and depending on the processes, you would find that very detailed mandates or very, very broad, so that the discussion or the issues are solved during the negotiation without prejudging any position in the table.
And when you're in those negotiations, I mean, how does that actually work? And who's talking? I mean, you know, because as an MEP, we did a lot of trialogue negotiations between the different institutions, and there was always one person talking from each side, effectively, you know, the chief negotiator equivalent. You know, no one else officially talked, but everyone would behind the scenes sort of quietly sort of feed into that one spokesperson. I mean, is that how it works in these trade negotiations, in your experience? The
hierarchy is very important. You have the minister, the deputy ministers, the chief negotiators, and then the heads of the different technical groups. So when you have a meeting with your counterpart being a chief negotiator, you talk to the chief negotiator and they organize. They provide the structure of the negotiations. So they decide when to meet, if there's going to be a formal round of negotiations or just an informal round. If there are groups that will be meeting virtually between rounds, and every technical group is there to address a specific chapter. So you have, in a negotiation, you have a chapter in market access, a chapter in routes of origin, a chapter in SPS issues, and so on and so forth. So you appoint a responsible for each side, for each negotiating group, and they are the ones responsible to report back to chief negotiators on the developments, on the progress made, and what needs to be done to keep moving forward, and at some point in time, conclude the negotiation of that chapter. And when there are problems, chief negotiators provide guidelines of what's next, what issues should be explored in order to find solutions. And if after several rounds that's not an effective proposal, then chief negotiator will try to negotiate with other elements that are coming to that level from other technical groups that have not been able to resolve their own issues. So, and there is a trade-off. You try to fix things as much as you can as chief negotiator. And of course, there will be things that would be for decision of higher level officials, deputy ministers. In the case of the European Commission would be Deputy Director General or the Director General of Trade, and the commissioners when it's a minister's level. But when you reach that point, it's because you have to take a political decision that is not easy for anyone at the lower level, or because you have reached the end game. And so the final, most difficult decisions have to be made and have to be less than 5 in my experience, so that they can take the final decisions on those issues and announce when they have reached an agreement in principle.
Just remind everyone who's listening that you can ask questions via the chat if you want to ask any questions. I mean, the interesting thing that I think, on the EU side, what's it actually like negotiating with the EU? Because I think the EU has a reputation of being a pretty tough negotiator in trade deals. We're all seeing publicly in the Brexit negotiations that the EU looks pretty tough there. What's your experience of actually, negotiating with them? Because, obviously it's a unique type of setup with the European Union. It's not just one country, of course, it's 27. So how is that? How does that play into the negotiations? Do you need to do things differently when you're negotiating with the EU than with the US or with Japan or with another country?
Yeah, no, it's a unique experience negotiating with the European Commission. The setup is unique as well. You are facing one counterpart, but the position they are having on the table reflects the position of 27 member states. And coming to this position was very difficult for them. So anything you like to change is a complex task. And they use it in their own favor. They said, I cannot move on this, otherwise I will have to change or to explore changes to this approach with the member states, and that's not going to be easy. So even though sometimes the technical experts from the European Commission realize that the proposal coming from the other side is better, because of the own constraints of the European Commission, it's difficult for them to change the position. The European Commission has evolved. The way they have negotiated free trade agreements have evolved. I was part of the team that negotiated with the European Commission in late 90s, the first free trade agreement that the European Commission negotiated with a country in America. And at that time, it was the Parliament was not very aware of what's going on in trade negotiations. The civil society was not publicly speaking against free trade agreements at the time. So it was easier for the Commission to negotiate a free trade agreement. And even though DG Agri at that time was not ready to give concessions on agriculture, at the end, in order to find a balanced solution, DG Trade was able, talking to member states, giving concessions. In that case, for Mexico was important some agricultural products that were addressed through limited concessions, tariff rate quotas, for example. But now the European Commission has a lot of stakeholders that they need to convince that the final outcome is a good one. So you have NGOs, you have the trade associations, the European Parliament, and of course member states. So the challenge for the European Commission is getting harder to negotiate free trade agreements, and we can see the example of Mercosur. It took 20 years to reach an agreement, and even with this difficult discussion, it's not clear what's going to happen with this free trade agreement in Europe, because of some concerns related to environment, for example, and agricultural interests on the defensive side. So if as a negotiator, if you negotiate with a group of countries, normally you see the faces of, in the case of Mercosur, there are 4 people representing their national interests. But in this case, the European Commission is a very powerful counterpart that is difficult to move in a negotiation.
I guess that leads straight on to one of the questions we've got in the chat then, from Giselle Lopez Garcia, in terms of, when you're dealing with a tough negotiator, and I think the EU, because of that setup, obviously is a very tough negotiator. It can't be flexible in the room, maybe in the way that some countries can be. So how do you deal with that? What's your strategy when you're negotiating, with a tough party, because in the end, you delivered a trade deal, an updated trade deal, and there were some big issues in the Mexico-EU one, sugar, for example, and some others. So how did what was your approach to doing that, to breaking that deadlock?
I think that patience is rule number one. You have to be patient, and you have to convince your teammates that you have to be patient. That even though you know that you can plan ahead and have a good strategy, this is a different setup. So it will happen that negotiators would get frustrated when they face the European Commission, because they are not used to this lack of flexibility, this lack of movement. So yes, they will move, but they will move at the very end. And I think it is very important to have to list the priorities. So they would be ready to move at the right time, but on the most important issues for you. So you better pick the most useful elements of the negotiation that you want to have to show back home that this is a good negotiation. So if you want to change the wording of, and it's just a cosmetic change, it will cost you. It will cost you in terms of concessions, because they will come back and request for concessions. So if it is not an important change, move on and try to get to the substance and keep pushing, because once you don't push for your interest, they would perceive that this is not important for you anymore, and so that the proposal from the Commission could be acceptable. So there are a couple of misunderstandings that normally happen in the negotiation, but you will learn as the process moves forward how to make progress, and progress is not going to happen at technical groups. The flexibility that the negotiators in the European side have to make to give concessions in the table in the technical group is very limited. So the big decisions would come from chief negotiators and up.
It's fascinating that the challenge that I think you'll see at the moment the British negotiators having, particularly on when you mention surprise sometimes that there isn't an immediate flexibility, which tends to be as you outlined, the way the European Union does things. We've got another couple of questions in here, and there's a couple of other issues that I want to touch on in terms of other stakeholders in a second. Maybe we'll get to them in a second, but I think there's an interesting issue here which tailors maybe all trade deals. And then this is a question from Robin Noble, who says some trade negotiations get a lot of press about what are arguably small issues, specifically types of cheeses. We mentioned this morning about things like chicken or fisheries. As a negotiator, first of all, his question is that helpful or unhelpful for you as a negotiator? But secondly, as a negotiator, how focused are you on the ins and outs or the rights or wrongs of those particular arguments? And how much of this is just about trying to get an agreement with whoever's in the room with you? And how do these issues, which arguably are small on the overall sort of economic value, but really, really important politically, how does that play out in the room, and how do you deal with that as a chief negotiator?
As a negotiator, you have to respond to your constituencies, being the parliament or private stakeholders, the trade associations that provided with inputs on what are their expectations from this process of trade negotiations. So I would say that regardless of the press outside, that you have to be aware of this, what's happening, what has been said, and be ready to respond. At the end, what really matters is what the Senate or the Congress would say about this. If you comply with the mandate, there is one. and most importantly, the producers. So you have a cheese producer, and sometimes if they negotiate, for example, with Australia, they will feel vulnerable. But if they negotiate with Japan, they would like to have market access. So you have to consult the stakeholders to see if they will have an offensive or a defensive position depending on the negotiation. And you need to gain trust with them because you will need them for the next negotiation. So if there is an opportunity to export more or to get more access on Stilton cheese, of course you are going to push for that and try to get as much as you can. Of course, Japan, if I use this example, would say that it will be very difficult because dairy is a very sensitive product and they cannot give more access on a specific dairy product because then a big exporter such as Australia, New Zealand, or even the European Union would request more concessions on the sector. But for the British government, this is a valid request, and they need their stakeholders on board for this negotiation and for the next. So every negotiation is different, and you need to please your stakeholders. At the end, those are the ones that would approved what you have done in the negotiating table.
I have two questions that come directly from that response, if you don't mind. First one is, how do those private stakeholders actually influence it? You say from the negotiator point of view, you need the input from the stakeholders, but then how do the stakeholders actually do it? And the second question, which is sort of linked, is you mentioned there just with, for example, if the Japanese were to give the UK more access on Stilton cheese, that the Australians or the New Zealanders might come to the Japanese and say, hold on a second, you've given them this, we want this. And there are some suggestions in some of the EU trade deals that they do that there is a sort of MFN type of clause in there that, if the EU is going to offer better terms to a one-third country, then it should be reciprocating them with other countries that it has made the deals with. So how does that play into that? Because that then makes the whole thing a delicate balance from what I can see for the negotiators, but also the politicians.
Yeah. Well, it's in the interest of the own negotiators to be close to the stakeholders, to know what is the situation. So if they have an offensive position in a negotiation, they need to know why. There are real expectations, there are real opportunities in market access, or it's just not going to happen. If you are talking to the real representatives of the sector, is as well important, because you may have 3 dairy national associations in your own country and with different positions. So you need to talk to them and try to have consensus on the position your country will have in that specific negotiation, and to understand why they have this position. Maybe it has to do with tariffs, maybe it has to do with rules of origin or SPS issues, and you need to be clear that if they have a defensive position, how you are going to present the proposal to the counterpart so that you represent well, you defend your national interests well. Stakeholders are crucial in any negotiation, and in the case of Mexico, they used to travel with the Mexican team. So we had meetings in Brussels, and at the end of every day, at the end of the day, I would say 4 to 5 times a week, we would meet them afterwards. So we would have a meeting at 7:38 p.m. and go through the process and explaining this is the situation, we are moving forward on this and this, but I need to talk to the dairy producers because we need to make a decision, for example. And so because it's of the interest of the dairy producers, they are there. You don't have to call them back to Mexico. They are there, and you meet with them for hours trying to see if you can have a TRQ on this cheese, but not on Stilton. So you go through the sector and try to spot the real concern. So, and then you translate this into a negotiating position in order to defend them. So that's why it's very important that stakeholders are heard by their own governments. And can you recall what was the second question about?
Yeah, the second question was the impact on when concessions are given to one party, the impact that might have on their relations with other. So, for example, you know, if Australia has seen that Japan has given the UK a bigger quota on cheese.
The MFN, yeah, the MFN. Of course, if you give a concession on a specific process, it will be, I mean, your counterparts will take note that you have done this, so that you have room of maneuver there. So you will receive a request. However, again, if this is not an important issue, in the case of the European Commission, they will know. So you can see that in the case of CETA, the TRQ on beef for Canadian exporters is 100,000 tons with no in-quota duty. But then what happened with Mexico is that the TRQ is less than 20,000 tons with in-quota duty. And then with Mercosur, it's a different treatment. So every negotiation is different. However, of course, it gives a signal that you can do something. So, but it does not necessarily mean that they would replicate the same concession. So the precedent is important because the counterpart will say, yes, you said that you cannot give me this, but you have done this in the past. You have done this with South Africa. You have agreed on these safeguards, the wording, I want that wording. And they said, no, this is not going to happen because we have already problems with the parliament and with some member states, so we cannot replicate that wording. And they say, okay, is this important, really important for the negotiation? And then you can forget about this, but then you, for what is really important for you, you will come back and say, okay, you've never done this, but I want this. So you have to make the exception with me. And it happens in some customs concerns that Mexico had. So you have to be aware of what happened in the past with other concessions that your counterpart had made, but you have to be ready to consider that this is not important for you, but what is really important, you need to be creative and find the language, the right language for you.
Because I assume, does this all play into the balance of the trade deal as well? Because, you know, the Canadian beef TRQ, for example, that, you know, the Canadians would have given some concessions back to the EU, probably in a different area, to have got that concession in the first place. That maybe Mexico, maybe, for example, is not prepared to give. So I imagine that plays into the whole, you know, the sort of nothing's agreed till everything's agreed type of approach.
Yeah.
One other question I wanted to ask you on this particular topic is during the negotiations that you had, the Mexico EU ones, you were actually based in Brussels, weren't you, as the chief negotiator? And it's interesting you mentioned that actually some of the industry figures had traveled with you, so you could actually talk to them here in Brussels after the rounds of negotiations. But as a trade negotiator, first of all, is that normal that the negotiating team sort of decamps and lives in the capital of the other country? And, you know, what benefits did you have from having that, from being here all the time?
Yeah, well, that is not normal at all. But at that time, Mexico had 2 to 3 years to conclude 2 big negotiations. So with the modernization of the agreement with the European Union and the new NAFTA or the USMCA. So the teams would be divided, dealing with the US and Canada and dealing with Brussels and with other commitments as well. So the decision was made that the chief negotiator will be based in Brussels to have the right contacts and with a technical team here, a few people that could deal with the technical issues. But then when people would come from other negotiations to Brussels, I could give my direct experience with direct information of what's the situation here and keep the communication with my counterpart, the the chief negotiator from the European Commission, if I had something, a concern or whatever, we could go and have coffee, we could go and have lunch in between rounds, and that is very useful. And it's not it's not the rule. So it was a very different experience. It gives you the advantage of sensing what's the situation with the parliament, for example, or with member states, when the counterpart, in this case, the European Commission, says that the GIs is a very important issue. So you know already. So yes, this is important for these countries, but maybe not for these other countries. Or what is the discussion? What is happening with the trade and sustainable development chapter? Is it going to be sanctions, because the parliament was at that time was requesting to change the approach and request sanctions in the negotiations, or the Commission has this discussion under control and they could keep to this approach of peer pressure, for example. So being posted in Brussels provides the advantage of knowing firsthand what's going on.
Interesting. That ties in a little bit with a question that we've got in from Georgia Krum, related to COVID and the fact that now there are, of course, trade negotiations going on around the world, but in the age of COVID, you know, those face-to-face meetings obviously can't always happen. So, you know, how does that play into this whole dynamic? Because of course that face-to-face communication, these behind the scenes sort of things, you know, that a coffee and everything, none of them can happen. So how does that play into this, you know, and how does that affect the negotiations?
Yeah, I think it's not fun. That's the first answer that comes to my mind, because you have the meetings and then you have a break and then you discuss over coffee. You provide ideas, you exchange views informally, that you cannot do that in the meeting room. So I have not experienced negotiations in a virtual mode in the times of COVID, but it's a different game. So I think that the negotiators would have to find a way on how to communicate informally, and not being in physical contact as well. I guess that affects as well the trust that you normally build when you are in the table. And I'm not sure if they turn off the camera or not to the rest of the team, but if you're talking to the chief negotiator and you say something, it's always interesting to see the faces of the rest of the team. Maybe you hit a nail that is key for the solution, and you see that maybe a different DG in the negotiation liked your idea because of the face they had, but you cannot see that, I guess. I'm not sure in a virtual meeting. So I think that it would take time to learn how to read the counterpart in this new era.
And the informal side of this as well. I mean, you were mentioning a little bit there. You know, certainly, again, negotiating, you know, an EU law within the EU, a lot of the actual breakthroughs are made quietly outside of the negotiating room, where we're chatting informally over a coffee, trying to find a way to do it. I imagine, is that the same in trade negotiations? Do you have a lot of informal contacts, and there's a lot of the real movement done in, you know, outside of the negotiating room?
Yes, the most critical meetings, or the meetings that you make progress, or give you the idea on how to make progress, is when you have a lunch. Normally, in negotiations, you have lunch once in the round, or you have dinner, and in that setting, negotiators are more comfortable in sharing ideas on how they see the process moving forward. So if we have 10 pending issues, they informally discuss, what if we do this? Would you be able to fix this for me? So this what if happens in an informal setting rather than in a room where it is the final wrap-up of the report of the technical groups with a lot of people in the room. So you need this kind of setup, but I'm not sure these virtual meetings could be a setup for having informal meetings outside any formal conversation. So, but I think it's a must to have informal exchanges so that your mind may create new ideas on how to solve issues.
It's fascinating behind the scenes look at things. We've got another question in from Alejandro Flores, relating a little bit to the previous discussion we're having, but I think it moves it on a little bit, where he says, in the example that was mentioned about the private sector working together with the chief negotiators, have you encountered any pushback from supranational bodies, for example, the WHO, of conflicts of interest here?
No. When I was talking about the being close to private stakeholders, you have, as chief negotiator, you have to be close as well to national authorities. You have to be close to the Ministry of Agriculture. You have to be close to the Ministry of Finance or the Customs Office. You have to be close to the Health Ministry. Why? Because of medicines, for example. Intellectual property is a big discussion, and the level of protection, patents, and all this is a public policy. So you need to have the national government aligned in a negotiation, and international organization would not normally comment on any outcome not in my experience, on the outcome of negotiations. Maybe it would be more of a civil society concern and NGOs making the point of medicines available to all. But I haven't heard, for example, on the WHO on a free trade agreement. Of course, they have a lot to say on health and health policy, but that is being discussed in Geneva, for example. They make international agreements and they invite people, for example, from the WTO, national experts on how to regulate trade, but without going beyond international trade commitments.
It's interesting as well, though, because I think the coalition of support behind trade agreements in the European Union in particular, particularly those, I think, the centre left tend to support trade agreements in Europe generally because they see them as a means by which they can spread European social environmental values particularly into developing countries around the world, which means that that's quite a big part of the debate, as you see, in Europe. That's the trade-off. Do you see that quite the same in other countries? I mean, when you go to negotiate with the Japanese or with the Americans, I guess, are you wary that there's that element to it?
I agree with you. The free trade agreements are normally because of geopolitical interest. You would like to increase the bonds with your like-minded friends. So it's good to have a free trade agreement with a country that is close to you. And because of economic interest, you don't want to pay tariffs anymore. And this country that you are going to negotiate a free trade agreement, they already have a lot of free trade agreements. So you see that that's unfair to keep paying tariffs. So you engage in negotiations. I would say that negotiations of free trade agreement between developing countries is very rare that you will have a trade and sustainable development chapter, for example. Labor or environmental concerns are not important. The important thing is the rule of origin, is the level of the tariffs, the commitments on services, but is not as important to discuss labor or environment. With Japan, I would say this is the same. If you fix the tariffs and the trade, it's good to have a free trade agreement. And if it's good to have a chapter on trade and sustainable development, okay, but maybe not a very futuristic or very hard to comply chapter. But with Europe, that is different because of what you said, the European values. And so it's not enough to give concessions to whiskey or to cognac or vehicles. The European Parliament and civil society would demand as well to have a strong chapter on environment, on labor, and if these standards are below in the country, in the other country, then MEPs would react and request these countries to comply with the international standards on human rights, on labor, environment, etc. So it's different from region to region, but countries willing to engage in discussions with the European Commission, they have to be ready to make extra commitments on trade and sustainable development. And of course, with the US, it's the same situation. But in my view, the sanctions approach they have is a way to have an extra tool to protect their own industries. So the different approach reflect the different objectives in my view. Europe is about exporting European values, and the US is having more tools in case of there is a case that they deem that they need protection because of, I would say, labor or substandard, then they can take measures against imports coming from that country.
Do you think then, if I ask maybe a controversial question, but if trade agreements often for to get that coalition of support from Europe, it's about spreading European values on social and environmental areas. Is that one of the reasons why Europe, in your eyes, struggles a little bit maybe to do trade deals with those countries that have similar social and environmental sort of outlooks, or developed countries like the US, like the UK, like Canada, where although they got a deal, there's of course big political and still big political challenges to Canadian deal. Whereas a deal with Mexico or with Vietnam, for example, which was done recently, sailed through relatively uncontroversially.
Well, it's interesting to see, for example, that Korea, that is a country relatively developed, it's a developing country, but I would say high income developing country. Europe is having an issue with Korea on labor standards. So my perception is that the Europeans have this spirit of going beyond the trade concessions and having labor and environment as a key, as a basis as a major component of the trade policy. But when they negotiate with the US or other developed countries, the assumption is that they comply already with the labor or environmental standards. It would be interesting to see, for example, what's going to happen in the discussions between the US and the European Union in the absence of the Paris Agreement, because of the US has dropped out of the Paris Agreement. And the Green Deal demands the Commission to include the Paris Agreement as a key component in the negotiations. So normally speaking, we would say that the US and Europe would have the same standards. So this is not a major concern, in my view, other than the Paris Agreement, with the member states of the European Parliament. So they are more focused on what's going to happen on government procurement, or if GIs there's going to be something on GIs, or there's going to be trade negotiations on tariff. They will discuss tariffs on agriculture or not, because it's a very hot topic for member states. And so, but with Vietnam, the discussion was different. It was what's going to happen with labor standards. instead of concessions on agriculture, for example. So I guess that the European vision is that with developed countries, there are already high standards. So they would negotiate a chapter on trade and sustainable development, but it's not the major focus of the discussion.
That's very interesting, and I think you know, we've been talking for 45 minutes. We've touched a little bit on tariffs, and I think, of course, in the press, when we talk about trade deals, the press are always thinking about tariffs. It's always about tariff reduction, but ultimately, tariff reduction is one part, isn't it? Because even if you reduce tariffs, if you have technical barriers to trade, then actually it's just as damaging in terms of for market access. So, to what extent do these technical barriers for trade or non-tariff barriers debates take up your time as a negotiator? And you know, in many ways, are they more difficult to solve because they're related to different standards?
They are more difficult to solve, but there are limits on what negotiators can do to address specific non-tariff barriers. The normal approach is to have the WTO agreements included in the free trade agreement. So you have the import license agreements, for example, that provides disciplines on how countries are expected to provide import licenses. Sometimes countries request an import license issued by the government so that the product can be imported. So there are rules. And so you take the agreement from the WTO and you improve the wording. There are countries identified things that can go beyond the WTO commitments, and they engage in discussions, and they have an improved version of import license or technical barriers to trade or custom valuation. All different non-tariff barriers are discussed, and there is language included in the agreement that is improved. But there are few examples in which sectors are protected with specific concerns. And one of the examples is the automotive sector, which the European Union has followed a sectorial approach, which is they go beyond the technical barriers to trade chapter. This is a general language. But since there are specific issues of concern for European car makers, the European Commission has negotiated these sectoral approaches, and they basically try to ensure that their products would not face difficulties in terms of labeling or security standards. So the European standards are accepted by the importing country. And from there, you can have a discussion as well on wines and spirits. This is an important issue for DG Agri. And they have as well a sectoral approach, and they say, the wine has to be produced like this, or in the label, you have to include the alcoholic content, things like that. So there are specific concerns that are addressed in these sectoral approaches, but it doesn't work for all the sectors. I remember that in the case of Mexico, Mexico tried to push for a sectoral agreement on chemicals because it's very difficult to export chemical products to the EU, but the EU is very strict in the way they regulate chemicals, so it was difficult to have an outcome on a sectoral approach on this sector. So non-tariff barriers become the barriers that exporters will face, and they will not. Of course, there are non-tariff barriers today, but they evolve. So you don't know in 5-10 years' time what kind of barriers your sector will be facing in that market, even though the tariff is gone maybe from day one on the free trade agreement. So you can have immediate tariff elimination, but maybe you cannot export your product, and this is a good example of the Canadian beef. They have this big TRQ, but it's very difficult to comply with European standards. And of course, the European standards respond to the request, to the necessities of European citizens, and they are normally higher than the average in the world. So it's a nice market with high prices, but very difficult to comply with the standards. So it's not only about tariff concessions, but on complying with the standards.
I guess that means a trade negotiator's job is never done.
Yes, and the specific trade irritants are discussed once you implement the free trade agreement. There are committees following up on the implementation of each chapter, and governments discuss on how to improve trade, and precisely once you have the disciplines and the free trade agreement is in place, the discussion is about specific concerns that are related to specific products. So there is a standard that is going to be implemented, fertilizers or banning pesticides. Then the discussion is not about how to renegotiate, how to change the wording of the agreement, but how the country is implementing domestically their own measures so that they are not a new barrier to trade.
It's interesting, of course, because the debate, of course, from a British point of view, we're really following, of course, the Brexit negotiations. And I think many of the press and many of the thinking about this is once the deal's done, that's it. There's a deal and then we forget about it. Of course, that's not the case. It's, if it does happen, it's likely to need constant looking at. But that brings me on to, because we've got 10 minutes left, I've got two sort of more general questions about trade in general, if you like. First one is related to the UK. I mean, the UK obviously now is is going out into the world and trying to do trade deals as a new actor in this. What's your sort of prognosis for Britain's trade potential in the world? Do you think the UK is going to be successful in trying to make trade deals around the world and with the EU? And do you think they would, do you think the UK is going to follow the same trend as everyone else, or do you think that the UK might actually push for more liberalisation in the global trade environment?
I think the UK is in a unique position to start writing their own free trade agreements. The position 2 years ago was of the British government was to copy paste the agreements just to make it quick and guarantee market access opportunities in those countries that the European Union already had a free trade agreement. However, the new reality of the UK would not be the same after the 1st of January because they will be out of the single market. And by being out of the single market, the British products would not necessarily comply with the rules of origin that were crafted to specific negotiation between the European Union and the trading partners. So if the UK is looking to have as many FTAs as possible, my suggestion is to discuss rules of origin again and see whether accumulation with the European Union is a solution, or my perception is that there is a need to negotiate again rules of origin. In the case of the UK, I guess that they need to have a more flexible approach on rules of origin so that the British company will comply with the rules of origin. Because now, if British exporters are aiming to pay no tariffs in Canada, for example, or in Mexico or in Japan, but they are using German inputs, German inputs would not be originating. So depending on the specific conditions, rules of origin can take British products out of the market, even though the idea is to eliminate tariffs. But I guess that every sector will have to make their own position paper, and have a look at the reality. If they, what is the supply chains, how it works in the products they do in Britain, and then from there, propose the British government a rule of origin that suits their needs. not just copy pasting what the EU negotiated in the past.
This rules of origin issue is quite interesting, isn't it? Because it would need, for example, the example you mentioned of German components in a British car. That's going to need an agreement on rules of origin, not just between the UK and the EU, but also between the UK, EU, and the third country, and in this case Canada and all the others. So that necessitates some close cooperation, first of all, with the EU, but secondly, that all of those third countries recognise that, and that to me seems quite a big jump in trade history, if you like.
Yeah, because maybe the assumption is that accumulation would solve all concerns, and that is fine. However, what's going to happen if the UK would not reach an agreement with the EU? So you base your concessions on accumulation with the European Union, but at the same time, you don't have an agreement with the European Union. So maybe the accumulation of origin was linked or conditioned to the fact that the UK and the European Union would reach an agreement. So suddenly you cannot take into account European inputs or parts to produce a product in the UK and request the tariff benefits in the importing country. So all these things are interlinked, and that's why my suggestion is that the British government would have to look at sector by sector on an ad hoc basis, what's the best rule of origin. Mexico has a specific way to negotiate rules of origin, which is different from the Chileans and different from Mercosur, and Japan has their own set of rules of origin that when they engage in trade negotiations, they converge, they made trade-offs and end up with a single set of rules of origin. But in the case of the UK, that means starting from the scratch. But I think that's the best solution, so that stakeholders are sure that the best rule of origin for them has been taken into account.
It's fascinating, the complexity of trade once you really get into it. So we're nearly out of time, but I've got one last sort of general question for you, and that is, what's the future of the WTO and the current global trading system? Do you think is it in trouble, or are you more optimistic for the future?
No, it is the WTO is in big trouble. It was already before when the Trump administration arrived. They changed the trade policy, and they started to implement measures out of the blue to protect their own interests. And they were in a kind of a trade war with China. And so suddenly the multilateral system was not reacting to protect the interests of the membership, because there was a country increasing tariffs just because of they had the way to do it through the Section 232. So the WTO could not address the concerns of the membership, and then this member continued to I would say sabotage the dispute settlement mechanism by not appointing appellate body members. So the WTO, instead of moving forward on new rounds of negotiation on how to improve the disciplines, the trade disciplines already agreed by 164 members, the WTO is losing this relevance. So the WTO needs to get back on track in the coming 2 years by fixing, having new disciplines on subsidies on fish. There's going to be negotiations on e-commerce, for example. So there are opportunities there to make the WTO membership back on track and come to the table and discuss things, and hopefully in the future talk about larger things such as subsidies, internal support on agriculture, or how to improve market access in industrial and agricultural products. So there's been years and years since the Doha rounds failed, and I think the world needs now more multilateral discussions and FTAs would occur anyway. So countries are by themselves opening for more trade liberalization. So this needs to be reflected in the multilateral arena.
Well, thank you very much, César. It's at least a positive end on the future of trade, hopefully. We're out of time now, so I just want to say thank you very much for giving your time to this event. I think it's been a really interesting event. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And I want to thank Euraffex as well for helping us put this on. Also, as is customary at the end of the events, I've got to show you what the next events are coming up. So on your screen, you will see the next British Chamber events that are coming up over the next few weeks, which include post-COVID recovery series events, and a number of other ones, the European climate law in September, and we've got a conversation with the Governor of the Bank of England as well. So if any of you are interested in any of those events, please contact us at the Chamber, and we will try and make sure that you can get in on them. But thank you very much, César. Thank you, Euraffex, and thank you everyone for attending. And we'll close this meeting now, and hopefully I will see you all again at some stage.
Thank you.
Bye.